Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Welcome to Combat Story. I'm Ryan Fugit, and I served war zone tours as an Army attack helicopter pilot and CIA officer over a 15-year career. I'm fascinated by the experiences of the elite in combat. On this show, I interview some of the best to understand what combat felt like on their front lines. This is Combat Story. On today's Combat Story, we dive into stories of a handful of the brave men who were at Pearl Harbor during the tragic December 7th, 1941 attack that changed the course of history. These are stories of action, selflessness, and courage that few of us can imagine, but sound right at home with the other stories we often hear on this show, which should not be forgotten. To help bring these stories to life, we go to Pearl Harbor National Memorial in Hawaii, and we sat down with the National Park Service's David Kilton. He's the Chief of Interpretation at the Pearl Harbor National Memorial, and his job is to bring these stories to life. Prior to the Pearl Harbor Memorial, David had worked at the Rocky Mountain National Park, Carlsbad Caverns, Bryce Canyon National Park, Golden Spike National Historic Site, and Little Rock Central High School National Historic Site, which of course memorializes the desegregation of that school. In this episode, we start by setting the context for the events of December 7th and the lead up to the war, so we can better appreciate the very unique stories of service members who step up when the attack starts. David, thanks so much for taking the time to sit down with us today.
Yeah.
So we're here, obviously, Pearl Harbor at the Visitor Center. We got this amazing backdrop on a very powerful weekend, Memorial Day weekend. And I was so grateful that you would take the time to share some of these stories of the people that served here, obviously, in 1941. So what we were hoping to do is set the stage for folks. I think a lot of people, especially who listen to this show, are familiar with, obviously, World War II. We've interviewed a World War II vet who fought in Europe, in the European theater. But to just kind of set the context of what was going on just prior to the events on December 7th in 1941, what's about to take place.
We know that the events of World War II say in one pinpoint in time, you can say, invasion of Poland or Pearl Harbor, but there's a lot of things that led up to that. And I'd say within the Pacific theater of the war, events would have started even back to World War I for sure. And in World War I, Japan was an ally with us, and just they started to grow in their ability to have influence and even resources, but also were growing as the numbers within the empire. And with that, needed more resources. And so as they were trying to gain those resources, there was a denial of that and worry if Japan got too strong, how it might impact the other powers that were at play. And so they were restricted. And eventually they started to try to take by force. And there was the Sino-Japanese War and invasion of China, and the atrocities that happened there kind of even elevated kind of the regionals and the regional aspects of what was going on, and to try to stop the atrocities that were going on and the battles in China. And there were sanctions put on Japan, and that's one of the biggest would have been oil.
Yeah.
And as Japan's growing, forming this war machine, expanding their navy, oil was so important. They didn't have it on the island empire within the nation. So it kind of just kept coming further and further to a head. And now going back more locally to the story of Hawaii, the story starts long before as just the welcoming environment, the welcoming people of the native culture of Hawaii. Definitely, there was some friction with colonial powers. You probably maybe know a little bit of Captain Cook and his tragic ending, but even with that, the native Hawaiian people were still inviting and welcoming, and eventually the refueling station here, adding coal, providing for these steam-powered ships, and then eventually being a a welcome harbor as you look out across the way here, that made it easy to come in to beach without waves and things being a big factor. Eventually, the military presence establishing care would kind of set the stage that would lead us to December 7th, 1941.
I was really surprised. Obviously, as you mentioned, the resources, I think oil comes to mind. And I didn't, for whatever reason, realize how much of a supplier we were. And I think we ended up holding back. And there were these peace talk, negotiations going on in D.C. in the run-up to December 7th,
right,
and a very contentious set of negotiations where I think as the Japanese fleet is kind of covertly maneuvering to its attack position, they're waiting to hear what's going on in DC. Are the negotiations going to continue? Will we get the resources we need? And if not, that's almost a go, no-go for them to execute on this attack.
Well, and talking about the negotiations for just a minute, we have a large blown up letter of President Roosevelt sent, dated the day before.
It's amazing.
Basically,
It's amazing.
Trying to plead with the Emperor of Japan that we don't go to the war. We don't have that be the way that kind of the conflict and the vying desires would be resolved.
Yeah.
As that letter was written and sent, the ships were already on their way.
They're already on their way.
They're already on their way.
The letter David is referencing from FDR to the Emperor of Japan is dated December 6th, 1941, and it says the following on the very first page. Only in situations of extraordinary importance to our two countries need I address to your majesty messages on matters of state. I feel I should now so address you because of the deep and far-reaching emergency which appears to be in formation. Developments are occurring in the Pacific area which threaten to deprive each of our nations and all humanity of the beneficial influence of the long peace between our two countries. Those developments contain tragic possibilities.
One of the aspects of this story, kind of broader spectrum, is the Japanese service members that attacked on the morning of December 7th thought war had already been declared. So when they found out after the fact that that was not the case, and the declaration of war had not been received by the United States, they held that in shame for the rest of their lives.
I had not heard
that they basically attacked in this treasonous manner of without war having been declared.
That's interesting.
They hold that themselves kind of in contempt.
Yeah. I was really surprised reading about this, and it makes sense, how the Japanese prepared without sharing exactly what they were training for, as they were training in different areas that mimicked this harbor in Japan. And then ultimately, like, they're at sea and, okay, here's where we're going to attack. Much like as we were preparing for Normandy, like we weren't telling people exactly where we were going, but we knew how we had to train.
Yeah.
And so, I can imagine they're getting prepped and launching, and they have to be really careful as they're moving in the ocean. My understanding is very deliberate in how much they let overboard for garbage, like no communications in and out like they might normally do, to just get to that position where they can execute.
Yeah, basically going silent.
Yeah.
Just going stealth mode with this large contingent of ships, six aircraft carriers and refueling ships, because they did have to refuel at sea, which was another tricky part of the dynamics of coming, but just trying to go silent so that they could have it happen with that complete surprise that they were hoping. So.
And then obviously, there are really interesting stories, certainly for the people that listen to this podcast. There's an intel component where you've got some Japanese intelligence here reporting on formations. They're diving, poking around to see what's going on, reporting back. But could you give us some context on the day of, or the morning of, what is that day like, that December 7th day before the fireworks kick off?
So you brought into light a little bit of the intelligence that was gathered for quite some time before the attack. It's amazing, all the information that was gathered, and all leads to basically one astute naval officer
The intelligence officer was Takeo Yoshikawa, and he played a crucial role in spying on U.S. naval forces at Pearl Harbor before the infamous attack in 1941. His cover was as the vice consul at the Japanese consulate in Honolulu, and he effectively gathered critical information on the U.S. fleet's composition, movements, security measures, exploiting his diplomatic cover to avoid suspicion, which is what the best intelligence officers do. His effectiveness stemmed from his meticulous observation skills and deep understanding of American naval operations, which allowed him to provide the Japanese military with detailed and accurate intel, ultimately contributing to the success of the Pearl Harbor attack.
That became the result of a lot of fear that would grow all these Japanese spying and Japanese Americans spying on them and things like that. But it was basically one officer that basically very covertly did a lot of things, acted as a Filipino fisherman, watching movement of ships and all these things, and documented, had a tea house up the hill here that he had a spyglass and would watch things in the harbor from up there and take notes through these maps and all that was gained. But on the morning of, we've already talked about, there was these negotiations. There was some fear that things might escalate and that it was going to come to a head, and training operations that were being done. But it was a Sunday
morning. No holy stoning and no painting and scraping, but clean sweep down and then chow call, and we went to chow, and we ate in number 6 Kate's Mate, which were where we slept, and I picked up some oranges to take off. Some of the sailors didn't pick up, and to take to my buddy in sick bay. Singing me a song. Anyway, I walked back to my locker in the bakery passageway and got something, and I went back out on the forecastle deck and the port side, and then some sailors were hollering and pointing toward Ford Island, so I went to have a look, and about that time one of the planes made a turn, and I could see the big orange wing spots, and right away I knew it was Japanese.
Ships were in harbor, had done their dry runs and things, and kind of full maneuvers, and come in for Sunday to take leave, go ahead and have Sunday mass, and go to church and things like that. And quiet Sunday morning, people were just getting up, and playing reveille's about to happen, all those things. And that leads right into the...
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air, President Roosevelt has just announced. The attack also was made on all naval and military activities on the principal island of Oahu.
I started from my battle station, which was what they called Sky Control Platform, was about 7 decks up on the foremast. I was actually at my battle station before the general quarters sounded, but they started bombing runs and whatever, and they were dive bombing us, and they were torpedo bombing us from IAL landing and over toward the sub base coming in, and we were right in direct line with West Virginia and Oklahoma, and so we started firing at the high altitude bombers, and we could see our shells bursting before they got to the planes. So we caught a couple of bombs on the after deck of the Arizona, and one bounced off the top of one of the number 4 turret, I think, and went in the water, and one went clear through the after hull there. Then we caught the big bomb right behind number 2 turret on the starboard side, right into the magazines, and 1 million pounds of ammunition exploded. That shook the ship like it was just a dog would shake a rat or something. It was just a tremendous explosion.
One of the things that comes to mind as I was just looking back on this, clearly Sunday morning, so yeah, church services, but
you've got, is it 80,000+ service members, I think, are on the island.
Yeah.
And it's a Saturday night that they're just coming out of. Like,
Yeah.
For all the people who listen to this know, like, if you let a bunch of service members loose in a town on a Saturday night, it's going to get crazy. And then there are even stories I came across with, I think, some of the pilots who are like still in pajamas or tuxedos from the night before run into the aircraft. So not only are people getting up early maybe to go to mass and obviously taken by surprise, but you got people sleeping off the night before probably.
Correct. Yeah. And just coming back, that brings back the just coming back from leave and things. And some of them may be still on leave because if you didn't get back at a certain time, you might miss the boat going back to Ford Island, to your quarters or things like that. So they might have been, sleeping out on the beach or wherever, buddy's couch, wherever that might be, because they didn't make it back. And some of those would be some of the stories of survivor's guilt because their fluke situation that kept them from being back to their ship made it so that they survived the attacks when friends and brothers didn't.
Yeah. I was hoping we could kind of set the stage for this area. So we've got Ford Island, we've got Battleship Row, we've got, I think it's an area just north of Battleship Row where the aircraft carriers typically would be. Are there any other kind of key areas that you point out to orient?
We will often talk with visitors about what's called Battlefield Oahu. So to set the stage, there's military installations around the island of Oahu. And the main targets before they come here to the harbor of those attacking bombers who, and also the fighter planes would be the airfields, because they wanted to make sure they established air superiority before they came to the harbor and hit their main targets here to make sure they weren't in dogfights and things like that. Schofield Barracks, Hickam Field, Kaneohe Bay, they're hitting all these targets first before they come around here and even hit an airfield right on Ford Island, which is what you can see right here behind us, because they had seaplanes and hangars for them right here. And so they would hit those targets before they eventually would come, and Battleship Row and the Memorial today would have been one of the main places that they would want to hit. Now, on the other side of Ford Island, there is a ship on that side as well, the USS Utah. The Utah was not an active battleship anymore at that time. It had actually been repurposed, reconfigured, and was now a training ship. And one of the things that's amazing about the story of the Utah is it could be remotely controlled from air, land, or sea.
If you're surprised to hear that the USS Utah could be controlled remotely, you're not alone. I felt the same way.
Aboard another vessel is a delicate control mechanism which sends radio waves to the abandoned battleship. And the Utah is navigated without a man aboard.
Turns out the Utah had relatively sophisticated radio control equipment that allowed operators to modify her course and speed and permitted for realistic training by gunners and other battleships. So although surprising, the Utah could in fact be remotely controlled.
And so they could do different operations with that battleship. And the crew was trained. It was a much smaller crew than a regular battleship. They were trained when they do practice bombing raids to go down below decks so that they didn't get injured. And they would put railroad ties on the deck to reinforce it, to make sure when they dropped these bombs, it didn't impact and cause damage to the ship. And they would drop dummy bombs, small little bomblets, and even sacks of flour to make sure our United States bombers could zone in, target in, and hit their targets with those bombing runs. They'd also use it for anti-aircraft gunners to practice, and they had different installation of anti-aircraft guns to practice and train on the Utah as well. So that was on the other side of the island, which was where they usually had the aircraft carriers, which would have been another major target that the Japanese attacking forces were trying to catch on that morning, was aircraft carriers and battleships, the capital ships. Fortunately for the United States, knowing that there could be some things that would kick off, they had sent out the aircraft carriers to deliver planes to Wake and Midway and things like that. So they were out to sea or had either gone back to the mainland to get repurposed and some upgrades and things like that. So none of the aircraft carriers were in port. So, or we might be telling a different story and in a different location telling
I was really surprised just because of growing up in the military we're in today. The aircraft carrier is the preeminent force out there, but at the time it was battleship, right? So aircraft carriers would have been nice, but my understanding is the success criteria is we got to take out like more than half of the battleships,
right,
which are all in battleship row at the time, effectively.
So the United States had moved with kind of those friction and those things going on with Japan. They had moved a large contingent of the Pacific Fleet right here to Pearl Harbor, and so you had these 9 battleships. 8 that were in purpose, sitting here, most of them right across the way, right there. And they did a couple things, and this was both on the airfields and with the battleships, is there was fear of sabotage, knowing that there were Japanese Americans and a large Japanese number of people living here on the island, that some of them might, with their loyalties back to the empire and to their heritage, they might try to sabotage either planes or the ships or things. So the United States put them in closer proximity so that they could actually defend and have security over those resources without expending more of their own resources.
Being sabotage, which is a different security posture, obviously.
So they had these ships 2 abreast, most of them tied off side by side, and on the airfields they had all the planes wingtip to wingtip. Yeah. So for the strategic plan that the Japanese Empire and their commanding officers had made to attack, it made those targets much easier to cause huge devastation because they're all there in close proximity. Drop the bombs, get multiple planes at once, or hit the torpedoes coming down, or drop bombs, and they get multiple ships all with one piece of ordnance.
Yeah.
We were trying to just self-preservation there because we were getting burned all to hell. We knew that we were trying to just move around inside the director. We had a little protection there because we were inside, but it was just so hot and whatever, just terrible. And after the fire kind of went down and the sea breeze blew the smoke and stuff away, while we got out on the deck, and the deck was just so hot you couldn't hardly stand on it, and we couldn't sit down and we couldn't do anything. We were trying to get away to get off of there, and noticed a gentleman on the vessel on the after deck and got his attention, and he threw us a heaving line, which is a lead line on a smaller line, and tied off a heavier line. We pulled it across and tied it off on the Arizona and proceeded to go hand over hand across that line. There was only 6 of us went across that line, I think. But they finally got us in a shoreboat and took us to the dock and took us in an open-air truck to the hospital, which was a terrible mess.
So, and actually, we've mentioned the airplanes quite a bit, and I'll get some of the details wrong here, so just correct me if I'm way off, but there were more than, I think, 340 U.S. aircraft on the island at the time. Mm-hmm. And we saw, I think it's 2 waves that come in from the Japanese attack with over 300 aircraft in total. So it's not 20 on 30. I mean, this is hundreds of aircraft. And we lose something like 300 aircraft, I think.
Over 200 that are
amazing.
Now, there were some planes that get up in the air, and there were some dogfights, but is one or two against the huge number of Japanese planes. And so the things that they were able to do almost stand out even more.
Yeah.
Those American pilots and gunners, they got up and were able to actually,
they were on
take out. They were by themselves and just.
One of the other aspects that I don't know how deeply we get into this, but the U.S. Admiral at the time, I think it's Kimmel, is that husband Kimmel, is watching this from, I think, his quarters, where he can see the bay here.
Yeah.
Or the harbor.
Yeah.
And he has to just watch this play out effectively.
Right.
I mean, I can't even imagine what that must have been like.
Him and General Short for the Army just discuss different things, come up with strategies how to be most effective. And one of the big things that was a worry is a land invasion. But so they were gearing up for some things like that, but they basically just had to watch this play out, and the devastation and the destruction, and just you can only imagine the what ifs and things like that they would beat themselves up for years and years after that.
As we get into some of the stories of these individuals involved, could you share where, as the first wave of attacks comes in, you mentioned some of the airfields getting hit, Ford Island, then they go for the battleships. Where does our first story come from? This first individual that you might highlight?
So the first individual I'll highlight is a story from the ship that was tied off to the Arizona, which is not a battleship. It's actually the USS Vestal, which was a repair ship that could service the larger ships out at sea here in the harbor. So it would have been tied line to line right there with the Arizona. And so just basically, if you look right across the water and see the memorial, underneath that, the memorial is the Arizona. So just on the outside of where the Arizona is where the Vestal would have been sitting.
And this is where Battleship Row is, right? Like they're all looking at it right there, and side by side.
Yeah, and if you look out and see the white structures that are sticking up kind of out of the water, those are the mooring keys or mooring quays where those ships would have been tied off. And if you go out across the water and get out close to them, you'll see names of ships all along it. It would have not been like if you go out there and you see like the West Virginia and the Pennsylvania, they're not side by side, but that's not those two ships each tied to those. It's basically when you see one name on one and the other name on the other, that's the two ships that would have been tied to that mooring keys side by side. So one of the ones you see right out here is the Nevada, and then the next key is blank because the Nevada was by itself. It was one of the few battleships that didn't have another ship tied off to it. So, and maybe we'll get into the story of the Nevada, but it was the only one that got underway. It's got an interesting story for sure. But so the Arizona right next to it, you'll see that when you go out on the memorial, you'll see the Vestal. The Vestal is labeled. So to tell her story, Joe George, he's a service member serving aboard this repair ship, the Vestal. He's a boxer as well, military boxer. He has a sanctioned military boxing match the night of December 5th. So he goes into his match, wins his match, super excited. Him and his buddies go out, super glad.
Big deal at the time, right? Like a boxing match, you'd have him on a ship, everybody's watching, that's what you do.
Yeah, okay. So it's a big deal. He's won his match. They go out to celebrate. Unfortunately, they get a little bit too carried away with their celebrations. Joe George and his buddies get into another fight that he's not supposed to be in.
Unsanctioned fight.
So Joe George gets taken into custody. So he is taken in by the military police. They put him in the brig of his ship, and so he's awaiting trial. And that's where he is on the morning of December 7th when the attack kicks off. As we've talked about, there's these two waves. The first attack, the Arizona's hit, sinks within minutes. When it's hit, if you're not familiar, this bomb from high levels dropped, hits the deck of the Arizona, penetrates down multiple levels, and then detonates amongst the ammunition of the Ford magazine. So when it blows up, that bomb kicks off all the ammunition around it. So this is why the blast is so magnificent with the Arizona lifts the ship even up out of the water, and then it sinks within minutes. So the fuel leaks out. So the Arizona is on fire. The fuel from the Arizona is leaked out and it's on fire. The heat from those flames is so intense, it's blistering the paint on the Vestal, putting the ship and its crew at risk. So with that being the case, all hands on deck. And this isn't just happening on the Vestal. This is happening so many other places throughout the harbor and at these other installations. So Joe George is eventually, his commanding officer releases him from his cell, says, "No, you messed up, but you know your job and I need everybody to work." So Joe George is given orders, and eventually he is told to go up and cut the lines, free the Vestal from the Arizona. So he goes up, and when he gets up there, getting ready to cut the line.
What are the implications for that, I guess, if he cuts it?
So if he cuts it, the Vestal gets free, and they're able to get underway, get away. They're not one of the main targets. The Vestal's not a main target. They may still take damage, but definitely get them away from the ship that may have further more explosions, the Arizona, and get them free to be able to save those lives. And so when he goes up to cut, getting ready, he hears crew from the Arizona that have climbed up onto the tower, trying to get out of the horrific situation that they are. And they're screaming for help. And so Joe George makes a decision. What he chooses to do is he drops the hatchet, grabs a rope line that's laying there on the deck, throws it across the way so that they can grab that rope, have a lifeline. They use that rope to tie to a heavier line, pull it across the gap between the two ships and secure it on either end. 6 of the crew, some of them have already been severely burned from those flames, crawl across that rope. Joe George saves their lives. He goes on, survives the attack, survives the war, and those other crewmates of the Arizona that survive want to make sure he gets recognized. And actually, this recognition would take years to happen. They ask, as they come out to commemorations here over years, what happened to the guy that saved us? What happened to him? So eventually, Joe George receives commendation for disobeying orders on December 7th because he was told to cut the lines, but he saved a lot
of lives. I like to go and pay my respects, and I look at the room there where all the names are and think about a lot of pictures that come into my mind of my shipmates and whatever, and say a little prayer for them and thank the God that I'm still here.
Wow. Yeah. That's incredible.
Yeah.
So, David, we talked Joe George.
Joe George. Yeah.
Fantastic story.
Yeah.
Who next? Who else comes to mind as you think back to some of these service members?
So as time carries out, kind of the role of what we're doing just evolves, changes. For a long time, we had veterans, survivors that came here and volunteered and shared their stories every day. And I can be the best interpreter in the world, be able to talk around and just give you these great visual impressions of everything that happened, but I can't hold a candle to that. And somebody that lived that experience coming in and sharing what they had happen. So one of the things that has also evolved is helping people to understand what has transpired throughout the world and even with the relationships that were forged in that time frame during the war and leading up to the war and afterwards. And so one of the stories and our roles and our missions within the National Park Service and here at Pearl Harbor every day is to help people understand how we tell the story of the attack, the war, the leading up to, and all these things, and then after, post, and really how peace and reconciliation would come after the end of the war. And just the elements of how that would be harder in some places than it was in others. And one of the stories that I think really highlights that story most significantly of one of the surviving veterans that I've heard of that was here at Pearl Harbor is the story of Richard Fisk and Kenji Abe. And so to tell you the story here, Richard Fisk was a bugler on the West Virginia. West Virginia would have been down past to where we see the Missouri today. Took 9 torpedoes on that morning. So just crazy. One of the things that's amazing about the West Virginia is different than the story of the Oklahoma. It took just as many torpedoes as they were able to counter flood the West Virginia so that it sank, but it didn't roll. Still a significant loss of life, over 100 lives that were lost on the West Virginia. But Richard Fisk, he did not lose his life. He did have to jump ship, swim through the water and things like that. And he carried some frustration, some anger, and that transpired through years with him
For the
Japanese.
Yeah.
Eventually, throughout his life, he started to come out here for commemorations, for anniversaries. And one of the moments in his life that really started to flip a switch is he came out here one day, goes out to the memorial, and he meets a woman of Japanese heritage that actually had close family member lose their life in the attacks on Pearl Harbor. So he has these feelings that have been there for a while, and he sees her come out and lay flowers at the memorial and pay respects to honor those that lost their lives, those U.S. service members that we honor on the Arizona. And it made him go, wait a second. And so he actually engaged with her. And when he understood the loss of life that she had to deal with as well, and a little bit of her story, he started to think more about his feelings and started to reevaluate them. Now, eventually, he, during one of the anniversaries, is asked to come and meet Kenji Abe, who was on a bomber attacking Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7th. So he says he'll do it. And they come together in this room, and they're standing a bit apart, look up at each other, sit there for a minute, and then they both salute.
Wow.
And this is the start of a relationship that would go through the rest of their lives. They eventually become great friends and talk, both of them, how they were soldiers doing the job of a soldier on December 7th, 1941, and throughout the rest of the war. They survived that ordeal. And if I have heard the story right, that first meeting, they chose to take a dollar bill and rip it in half and talk about how they were the parts of one whole. And they carried that dollar bill in their pockets for the rest of their lives. Through the rest of the anniversaries, they would get opportunities to meet several times. And as their friendship and relationship would grow, talked about being brothers, they would embrace and be in tears as their lives transpired and time passed, because they got to see each other again.
Yeah.
They got to be with their brother again. And they started doing this tradition where every year they would send flowers. 2 roses would be sent to the site for December 7th, 1941. There were the commemoration of every year for December 7th. And 1 rose would be placed in remembrance of those of Japanese heritage that lost their lives in the war. And 1 would be placed for those American.
Wow.
And that story of being able to overcome the challenges, the difficulties, the bias, the anger, the frustration of being able to have to do your job where you basically will have to take someone else's life, and maybe the challenges of what you saw with that, to become these close friends who respected and cared for each other. It is just, I think, a beautiful thing.
That's so amazing.
And it's what we try to help to bring about, because we still have to take that peace and reconciliation and come to grips with what happened here every day.
I think, as you mentioned it, we have to almost like remind ourselves that was one battle, like a significant day, but both of them, I was reading up on Fisk. I mean, he's fighting in the Pacific later on. I believe, if I read it correctly, like he was at Iwo Jima or part of that.
Yeah.
So it's not like a one-time thing. And then I would assume Kenji is probably fighting throughout the Pacific theater as well for the Japanese. Like, it's several years they're trying to kill each other. Yeah, in effect.
And I think I mispronounced his name. It's Zenji. I'm sorry I said it wrong. No, that's me. That's me. But yeah, and they did. And I know one of the stories I've heard about Fisk, and for reflecting on Iwo Jima is just a little Pearl Harbor every day. So yeah, they both went on to continue to do the work of a soldier.
Yeah.
And wow, yeah, it's amazing.
I think the quote that I saw from him was, Iwo Jima was like 36 Pearl Harbors in a row, something to that effect.
Right. Oh my God.
I think it's interesting. So one of the people we've interviewed is a former Marine officer, a guy named Elliot Ackerman. So he was in 2004, he was in Iraq leading as a platoon commander, a group of 40 Marines in Fallujah to the Second Battle of Fallujah. Probably one of the most significant battles in post 9/11.
Yeah.
He goes on to fight with the Marine Corps. He goes into Marine Special Operations. 15 years later, he's a journalist reporting in Syria, and a contact of his suggests he meets up with a former Al-Qaeda operative.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So in Turkey, at a picnic table, the two of them meet. They can't speak the same language. They're going through an interpreter. The interpreter, after several hours, has to take a break. And it's just Elliot, a former Marine, this other guy, former Al-Qaeda operative. And they get out a napkin and they start drawing like the river that runs through Iraq and different names of locations and the dates that they were there to see if like they were there at the same battle at the same time.
Oh, wow.
But he forms this connection with this guy who was, effectively the absolute enemy only a few years before. And so as you mentioned this with Richard, it just really strikes me. And I've heard my dad's a Vietnam veteran. He didn't have this experience. He was in the air, but a lot of Vietnam veterans go back and try to connect with these people that they fought against. It's just something, once you can get past the animosity and the bias.
Yeah. I'm going to bring out one of the experiences I have had that has been most powerful. I've had this amazing experience here, but two that were the most powerful that happened within about a week of each other. I had the opportunity in my role to welcome and host Japanese consulate and a contingency that was brought with his visit to go out. And some of them were even from Hiroshima. And they went out and had a special prayer meeting and an offering of flowers and just a moment of silence and just a powerful experience out there at the memorial in the shrine room. Within a week, I have a large contingency of high-level German officers from the military come out and do almost the exact same thing. And so having that moment within a week's time about who would have been recognized as our two greatest enemies in World War II come out and show that reverence and respect, and now are two of our greatest allies for the United States, is just a hope for the future, I guess, that even those times where we might feel, there's no way I can see any difference for who this is, or I have my grudges or things that, we can put it out past. We can come together. So, yeah.
One of the other stories that I wanted to touch on before we break is somebody who is somehow connected to our show, a good friend of mine who's a longtime listener of our show. His grandfather was here, Pearl Harbor, Walter Sealock, on December 7th.
Yeah.
And he was aboard the Shaw. And I was just hoping we could get a little context as you might know about them.
Yeah. So telling the story about the Shaw, and I have to admit, I'm excited because I got to learn another story. as you mentioned, we might talk about Walter Sealock's story, and so he would have been stationed aboard the Shaw, which was actually getting work done to it. So it was down Hospital Point. If we look, and it's hard to see because we got two ships. We still have an active military harbor right next to us. So we have two ships, but if you go to the left here, you can actually see some trees just to the right of those ships. And just in that region, right up against those trees at the mouth of the harbor, is what is known as Hospital Point.
Okay.
And that is eventually where the Nevada would run aground. And Walter Sealock's story talks about him seeing the Nevada as it got underway. Walter Sealock in his reflection or memory of his story here at Pearl Harbor talks about seeing the Nevada as it eventually ran aground right there at Hospital Point. But the Shaw was there in dry dock, right there next to Hospital Point, getting work done on it. In his story, he talks about they were welding in one of the magazines. So one of the storage locations where they'd have all the ammunitions was empty because they're welding in it. Don't want to be welding next to ammunition. But the other one did have ammunition. And this has some ties to the story of the Arizonas. Eventually, Walter's story talks about how he, that morning, came to grips, saw the attack. They're there up on deck doing work, saw what happened with the Arizona, almost had front row seats of things as they transpired. And eventually they thought, we need to get things out of here. We need to try to take care of the ship. And eventually the bomb comes down, and almost same story as the Arizona, hits deck, penetrates down, goes off near the magazine. They're trying to put out this fire. They're throwing buckets of sand on these flames, but underneath things are ticking off and things are starting to get more intense. And so they're like, whoa, we're not making any headway in this. And so commander there, the little group that's doing this says, we need to be done. And he's like, yeah, we need to get out of here. So they go up, get on the deck, and there's wounded up on the deck. The Shaw took about 106 eventually. We lost 106 lives that were lost. But there are these wounded, and they just started chucking them overboard into the water so that they can basically jump down, get them to a safer spot, and eventually pull them out of the water and rescue them. He said when he got ready to jump into the water to jump ship, he was one of the few that actually stripped down. So he was just in, bare things and could swim better, but jumped in the water, started pulling these individuals out of the water and was rescuing them, and they kept going back in. Well, eventually, they're close to Hospital Point. We're in an aid station where they can get those wounded service, but somebody eventually calls out and says, "Hey, you're hurt." And he's like, "No, it's just, I've been pulling wounded. I'm good." And they're like, no, wait, look. And so he eventually lifts up his shirt, and he got hit right above his heart. Took a bullet, took shrapnel, something right there above his heart. And eventually, as things progress, it was too close to his heart for them to do surgery. So they left it. They left this. So he would receive a Purple Heart, because he was wounded in combat. Would go on, and the Shaw, kind of telling the story of the Shaw, with the continued development of that flames, eventually got to the magazine, and it exploded, and the front half of the Shaw was just torn apart. Kind of funny thing about the Shaw is it was put back together, and it would continue to go back into service. And so they did restore it, put it back together, salvage it, and it served a purpose. So there were only 3 ships total that never went back into service out of all the ships that were damaged. And 2 of them sit in the water today. We talked about the Arizona, talked about the Utah. The third was the Oklahoma that rolled. And eventually they did right the Oklahoma. They salvaged the point and repaired it to the point that they could float it, and they were going to take it, sold it for scrap, or taking it back to the mainland. And on the journey back to California, the repairs didn't hold. Started to take on water, and as it was taking on water, it started to pull the tugs, started putting those tugboats at risk. So they cut the lines, and so the Oklahoma is about 500 miles off the Big Island, heading back towards California. I know that. Wow, sank to the bottom of the ocean. Now, I've heard, haven't talked with them in person, but some of the Oklahoma felt that was a more fitting end to the life of the Oklahoma, is that it went back to sea. But going back to Walter Sealock's story, just one of so many of just these sacrifices that were made. He continued to help, continued to work, injured through the tragedy of what was there, and his experiences would just impact him forever. And I think that's the story of Pearl Harbor today, is that what happened here over 81 years ago still has impact on our lives today.
Yes. Yeah. And actually, I think this is just a great place to kind of wrap up and make sure from where we started of that situation that's going on globally, regionally, the fight comes here. We talk through some of these people's events that they experienced. About 2.4 thousand U.S. KIA.
Yes.
In that.
Yeah.
We lose, 5 of our 8 battleships at the time? That day.
So basically all 8 of them would be damaged.
Or damaged.
Is damaged. I think 5 you're talking about were some. Yeah. And so, but, and the Nevadas is the story of hope. But yeah, like, cause they were actually people when they saw it running,
saw the flag,
they were like,
right?
Yeah, they were cheering and things like that. But yeah, but
none of the aircraft carriers, right? So they were all away at the time, over 300 or 200 aircraft.
Correct.
200 aircraft.
And numbers I've heard different, over 30 ships that were damaged and all but the 3 would go back into service.
Jeez. And then you walk these grounds every day, which is pretty cool.
Correct. And
yeah. I really appreciate the time, David. Thank you for not just spending time with us here, but coordinating and letting us be on sacred ground with you and the other people here sharing it, especially on Memorial Day.
No, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Been a pleasure. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this combat story. I know it's not quite like the other ones that we do, but I felt it was fitting in remembrance of December 7th, 1941. I also wanted to say a special thank you to David, Dan, and the National Park Service for letting us stand and record on what is hollow ground and taking us through some of these experiences. We got onto the Arizona. We got to walk through the memorial service. It was very special and moving. I hope you have a chance to get out there too. And special thank you to the National Park Service for welcoming us. I grew up, as many of you can imagine, if you listen to the interview I did with my dad, with Ed Fugit, he is obviously a veteran from Vietnam, but he is a military and geopolitical historian at heart, at his core. We would grow up, and I don't know how often this happened to other kids, but for me at least, every December, he would ask me the significance of December 7th. What is the day that shall live in infamy? What did FDR say about December 7th? What happened on that day? And we would talk it through every year. Even to this day, I'm certain on December 6th, we will get a call and he will ask if my 3 boys know what the significance of December 7th was, because it had such an important impact on what shaped history from that point forward. So I know we didn't dig into a current service members or veterans experience, but I wanted to tell the story of a few of these folks, just a handful, who experienced something that many of us can't even imagine and what they did on that day. And some who we didn't dive into, but who watched from the sidelines. And I can't even imagine what that must have felt like as a commander watching your fleet burn after a surprise attack like that. So with that, I just wanted to say thank you for listening. For the people who do listen, you all recognize the selflessness, the courage, and what goes into living a life as a veteran, as a service member. And I am so appreciative that you take the time to listen to these stories. Hope you found it interesting, insightful. Maybe you learned something, as I did throughout this. It's just amazing the scale of this battle. But with that, I just wanted to say a very special thank you to all of you. And I hope you have a moment where you can remember the significance of the day that shall live in infamy, December 7th, 1941. Stay safe, y'all.